My thought leader is a sophomore at Elliott.
Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Shakira Hall, and I'm a freshman at the college and also a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park Street side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag JFK Junior Forum Live, which is also listed in your program guide. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming Dr. Cornel West, Professor Robert George, and the Institute of Politics Director, Mark D. Guerin.
Good, Brother Mark.
After you, sir. Very good. And please. Thank you, Karen. Good evening, and welcome to the JFK Junior Forum. We're thrilled to have so many of our students and faculty and staff and Cambridge neighbors here with us. Tonight's conversation really fits into an important theme that our dean, Doug Elmendorf, has made evident throughout the year, and the importance of civil discourse and talking across difference. The emphasis here at the Kennedy School, bringing individuals here from a spectrum of ideas, runs through the core of the curriculum and certainly our work at the Institute of Politics. So we're particularly grateful to Dean Elmendorf for this very good idea. As a Princeton graduate, I had read about this. But our guests this evening really mark that the bonds of friendship that started at Princeton 10 or 11 years ago, and their opportunity that we all have here to learn from them as they have navigated this friendship across ideological difference, but born from their respect for one another and for the ideas that they encounter and interrogate. So we are very grateful to Dr. West and Professor George for being here. We're delighted to have you all here, and we look forward to a most engaging conversation. Welcome.
You want to just jump right in, my brother?
Let's do it.
Indeed, indeed. You gonna jump right?
Oh, you want me to jump?
Yeah.
You're the host.
Oh, well, it's a blessing to be here. And we're going to have about 45 minutes of dialogue, 40 minutes or so of dialogue, and then we'll open it up. We want to make sure as many voices are heard that are heard. We want to salute again, Brother Mark, for your leadership, and Brother Doug Dean as well. Leadership does matter. It makes a difference. And I want to start by handing it off to my dear brother Robbie, who has been 12 years that we've spent time together. We teach together. We've been in a variety of different contexts, from high schools, colleges, Air Forces Academy, ghettos, barrios, and so on. And it's a beautiful thing to be able to be in dialogue with someone you have disagreements with. You try to show the ways in which you can revel in their humanity and still take them so seriously that you try to point out the ways in which you may call into question certain kinds of conclusions that they put forward, or certain kinds of views that you don't agree with. For me, it's very important because how would I put it? For me, love is never reducible to politics. I think it's very important that we recognize the ways in which we can not just learn from one another and not just listen from one another, but actually have genuine friendships. And friendship is not reducible to agreement on public policy. And we live in such a moment of polarization and balkanization. We live in a moment so much hate and hatred and contempt. We live in a moment where it's hard to engage in not just civil discourse. Civil discourse is fine, it's important, it's indispensable, but we're after something deeper than that. We're after what it means to have human and humane bonds when you also have disagreements. And that's what we have been able to revel in, really, for the last 12 years with our loved ones together, our various writing together, teaching together, great books and what have you. And to be able to see that, that my dear brother has a integrity and honesty and a decency, even given my deep disagreements with him. And that's crucial. And it's not just a cliche. You see, it's something to live. It's something to enact. It's something to embody. And of course, this is true within our own families. I mean, nobody has full political disagreement within the family. So Thanksgiving is always a fascinating moment. A lot of diversity, heterogeneity, and variety of different views right around that table, but you still feel the love. Well, so it is with Brother Robbie and I in classrooms. So it is with Brother Robbie and I on the road. And so it is today here at beloved Harvard with all of the challenges that we have here at Harvard University. So let me hand it over to you, brother, because usually Robbie starts. I don't know why. It's the first time I've ever had to start. I'm at Harvard, and okay, all right.
I'll tell you why, because it's impossible to follow that act. I mean, that's why I go. It's that simple. It's pure self-interest. Well, I too want to thank you, Mark, and thank you, Dean, and thank Kessia, the undergraduate
Yes,
chairman,
absolutely.
And all of you for coming out this evening to hear us. It's a great honor to be at the Kennedy School. I have some association with the law school, both as a student and as a visiting professor on several occasions, and some association with the Divinity School, where I was also a student, and where I have friends. But this is my, I think, second time at the Kennedy School. The first time was to respond to Justice Stephen Breyer's Tanner lectures a few years ago, and that was great fun, and it's really a privilege to be back. And it is always a joy and a delight to be with my dear brother, Cornel. He mentioned that we've been at this together for about 10 or 11 years. It really began earlier than that, in the 90s, during Cornel's first sojourn at Princeton, before Harvard stole him the first time. It's now stolen him a second time. Don't appreciate that, folks, I'll tell you that, but I can understand why you want him. So we were together in some faculty seminars and didn't know each other very well, but I noticed some things. First of all, the guy was asking all the right questions. I wasn't always so sure on the answers he was giving, but he was asking all the right questions, and that's the most important thing in intellectual life. It's also a very important thing in political life. We'll get there, but it's certainly in the intellectual life, knowing how to identify and ask the right questions. And that's what Cornel did. And of course, then the second thing I noticed was the sheer intellectual integrity of the man. No matter what your political views are, religious views, moral views, views about whether Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare or somebody else wrote Shakespeare, whatever your views are about things like that, integrity is something that you have to admire. And that integrity, even in those seminars, was exemplified by a willingness to listen to people challenging the points of view that he was putting forward. That doesn't always happen in academic life, believe me. And to take on board insights that are coming from a different perspective, to genuinely listen, to genuinely engage. And when a valid point is made against a point somebody's making, it takes integrity to say, you know what, you're right about that. I'm going to have to shift things around a little bit. I'm going to have to take that into account. That integrity was on offer. And then, of course, as we became close friends after beginning to teach together in 2007, which is one of the great joys of my life. Then what I sensed, that integrity that I saw in those faculty seminars, I could see in full blossom that deep intellectual integrity. And then, of course, watching Cornel's work in the public square, I could see that integrity was more than simply intellectual integrity on intellectual matters. It was a much broader and deeper integrity, the sort that enables a person, is very hard to do, to speak truth to power, to speak truth to power even when your clan or tribe or group or association doesn't want to hear that spoken. The willingness to break ranks, when you think your side is doing something wrong or going down the wrong path. There's a lot of pressure on people to be team players, to always go along, not to criticize our guy or our side or our party or our team or our tribe. But Cornel exemplified the integrity that it takes to resist the temptation to just be a team player. There's nothing wrong with being on a team and supporting a side, having a view, but it takes integrity to know where the limits of that are. You don't compromise your view of what's true, what's good, what's right. You criticize when you need to criticize because the truth requires that, even if it might hurt your friend and even if it might help your enemy. The other thing that it takes, and of course this is really what drew me to Cornell, even going beyond the integrity issue, the other thing it takes is courage. And no one has exemplified courage in the public square. No public intellectual certainly has exemplified that courage more than Cornell has done. Sometimes it means that I've got to bail him out of jail, but that's all right. He's got the courage to
I do
state
appreciate that. Yeah, absolutely.
I can tell you some stories about that. So look, at the basis of the friendship on my end is a very high degree of admiration, just admiration. We may have our differences about this, that, and the other thing. They're important, about some important issues. But my goodness, I admire a person of integrity. I admire a person who exemplifies courage. I admire someone who's intellectually honest. And then, of course, beyond that, Cornell and I have a number of other important things in common. Something very important, of course, is our shared Christian faith. That creates a bond that doesn't necessarily require agreement on all details of faith. He's from the great Baptist tradition. I'm Catholic. We don't agree on all the details, but there's a bond there. It's a bond sometimes that religious people experience across the different traditions of faith. A Buddhist and a Christian, someone from the Jewish tradition and someone from the Hindu tradition can still recognize a commonality there. And even a commonality with a certain sort of unbeliever, an unbeliever who's a searcher and a seeker, someone like Camus, for example. A religious person will feel a bond and a kinship there. But we have this Christian tradition in common with a lot of powerful and difficult and challenging teachings that we share and we try to live up to. We try and fail and we try again and fail, try to fail better the second time, but we have that. And then, of course, there's a love of philosophy. This was really what prompted our teaching together. It began when through an odd sort of set of circumstances, Cornell was invited to interview a member of the faculty for a campus magazine, and he was told he could choose any member of the faculty to invite to interview, and he did me the honor, though we didn't know each other very well, of asking to interview me. And so we had a rather raucous, it was supposed to be an hour interview. It ended up being a 4.5-hour interview in my office for the magazine. And it was such a wonderful experience, such a deep exploration together of a range of very important philosophical, moral, religious, political issues, that when an opportunity arose, which happened very quickly as it turned out, to teach together, I jumped on that, proposed it to Cornell, and he immediately said that that was the right thing to do and that he would make time in his incredibly busy schedule to teach a seminar with me on the big issues, on the fundamental existential questions of meaning and value that are at the heart of human life, that we have to wrestle with whether we like it or not. We might try to avoid, but we can't. And so we offered a seminar in which we invited our students over a period of 12 weeks to read a great book a week, beginning with Sophocles' Antigone, and we read Plato's Gorgias, and we read St. Augustine's Confession, and all the way up to the modern period, we read Marx and Hayek and James and Dewey and C.S. Lewis and Martin Buber, and it was an exhilarating experience to be in the classroom with this man and to learn from him, which I quickly saw was something that was available to me as a co-teacher. I was also a student in that seminar in a certain sense. And so we decided on the basis of that success to continue teaching together. So to have a friendship, you need something in common. And it turns out we have really quite a lot in common. Now, we also found out that we have some views in common, despite our differences on a lot of other things. And one of those is a deep commitment to free speech, to liberal arts learning, what Cornell calls, following the ancient Greeks, paideia, and to democracy, or what the founding fathers of our country called they preferred the word Republican government. Those are shared, and those are very important shared beliefs. And on the basis of those shared beliefs, we found ourselves in March of 2017 getting together to compose a kind of manifesto, a statement of our shared principles, not because we shared them, but because we thought they were right and we wanted to put them out there and defend them and invite other people to join us. And that manifesto, which is available online if you want to read it, is called Truth-Seeking Democracy and Freedom of Thought and Expression. And there we tried to make the case for the absolutely indispensable importance of freedom of thought and expression to two things: the truth-seeking mission of institutions of learning, especially institutions of higher learning, and two, the project of self-government, democracy, Republican government. Now you notice, and those of you who have read it may recall this, we were gratified to have so many Harvard faculty join us as signatories, Professor Putnam, Professor Scotchpole, many others. But if you've read it, you will have noticed that we defend freedom of speech not as an abstract right, not as just a right that has no explanation, that's connected to no aspect of human well-being or flourishing, that is just dropped down on us from the heavens and we've got it and that's it, for no particular purpose at all. Here we followed the great John Stuart Mill, the great 19th century liberal political philosopher, in rejecting abstract right as a basis for freedom of speech and other civil liberties, and instead noting the importance of freedom of speech to the process or project of truth-seeking, to the project of self-government. I've made something of a career myself of being a critic of Mill's general libertarian political philosophy. I might be wrong about that, I might be right about that. Lay that aside for now. Whatever my criticisms of Mill, his utilitarianism, his libertarianism, I think Mill gets it exactly right in chapter 2 of his work on liberty, where he makes the argument that we should respect freedom of speech in order to promote the robust engagement of ideas with a goal to getting nearer and nearer to the truth, fuller and fuller an appreciation of the truth. We know we'll never get there completely. We know that whatever truth we have will be mixed with some error. Every single person in this room, if I ask the question, is absolutely everything you believe true, not a single hand would go up. Because we all know that some beliefs that we have are false. The trouble is, we don't know which ones they are. We know we're imperfect, we know we're fallible, we know not everything we believe could be true. And yet, with respect to each belief we hold it qua true. But knowing about our own fallibility, knowing that some of what we believe is wrong, perhaps much of what we believe could turn out to be wrong, we need robust discourse, we need the freedom that underwrites that robust discourse in order to challenge each other and to challenge ourselves to get rid of our erroneous beliefs and replace them with better beliefs, with truer beliefs, get nearer and nearer to the truth. So the argument for freedom of speech, at least the one we make, is not based on the idea that there is no truth, so anybody should be able to say or think whatever they want. It's rather that truth is very, very important, not just as an instrumental value, something that's valuable as a means to other things, but intrinsically, that the flourishing of human beings is in part constituted by our truth-seeking and truth-attaining, by a love of truth, by a desire to know the truth and to live in the truth. This is the message of Socrates. It's a message of Socrates is portrayed to us by Plato, especially in dialogues like the Gorgias, the one that Cornel and I used in our first seminar together. We need to be able to challenge each other and unsettle each other for that purpose. And there's a lesson in that for institutions of higher learning. Institutions of higher learning should not be for anyone, right, left, center, Christian, Jewish, atheist, whatever. It shouldn't be for anyone a place where you go to have all of your beliefs reinforced. It should rather be a place you go to have your beliefs challenged, precisely with a view to correcting any erroneous ones, and, as Mill points out in chapter 2 of On Liberty, to give you a deeper understanding and appreciation of the ones you are already right about. In chapter 2, Mill says, look, if I have a belief, there's a proposition, I affirm. There are a couple of possibilities. I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, someone who shows me my error has done me an immense favor, because truth is intrinsically valuable. In fact, he's done me an immense favor even if it's embarrassing for me to have to admit I was wrong. Socrates, as presented by Plato, treats that person as your best friend, the person who corrects you, even if he embarrasses you, as your best friend. So obviously that's a good thing. But what if you're right? What if you're right? Well, Mill says, if you're right, then answering the challenge of an informed, intelligent, penetrating critic will give you a deeper appreciation and understanding of the truth that you already affirm. That experience will enable you more deeply to appropriate the truth, to know not just that something is the case, but to understand more deeply why it's the case, and perhaps even what the significance, the larger, lasting, existential significance of that being the case is. So we have every reason in institutions of higher learning to promote a robust engagement of ideas and to make sure that in our courses we're unsettling each other. Faculty are unsettling students, students are unsettling faculty, students are unsettling each other. When we go around the country, I often say, if we're at this university or that university, that if all you hear at your university is a reinforcement of the views you already hold, if that's what you're hearing in your classrooms, if that's what you're hearing from the visiting speakers, if that's what you're hearing at the conferences you attend, you should demand your money back. Because whatever is happening to you, you're not getting an education. An education will challenge you, and it'll challenge you even if you happen to be right. So that sharing in the truth-seeking mission is very important to the two of us, as is sharing in the belief that robust dialogue, robust engagement, and the freedoms that underwrite that are critical to the process and project of self-government, of democracy. It's always a temptation, always has been, I suspect, because human nature will not change, it always will be a temptation to think, since we know the truth about this, that, or the other thing, we now finally securely know it, we should shut down any criticism of it, shut down any questioning of it. Bad things happen. It's disturbing. It's offensive. It can lead people to do bad things. The temptation is always there. It's not badly motivated, it's well motivated. But it's always a mistake. In my opinion, it's always a mistake. I think the historical record bears this out. At a minimum, we're failing when we do that to entertain arguments and ideas that, by challenging us even on the things we're right about, will deepen our understanding and appreciation of the truth, no matter what the truth is about, whether it's about religion, whether it's about politics, whether it's about who wrote Shakespeare. And in this, Cornel and I, of course, have a deep sharing as well, because we're committed to the democratic project. We're committed to Republican government. Why? Because we think that's the kind of government that is worthy of human beings, creatures with a rational nature and a dignity, one that we would give a full account of by saying creatures fashioned in the very image and likeness of God. But you may not believe that part of it. You may not believe there's a God or that God endows human beings with dignity. But if you believe in human dignity, no matter what you think the source of it is or where it came from, if you believe that rational creatures deserve a role in government, that they deserve to be self-governing creatures and not doomed to be ridden by booted and spurred aristocrats, as Jefferson said. If you believe that, then you should also believe in the freedoms that underwrite the kind of civic life, the kind of civic engagement, without which, I promise you, Republican government will fail. Final point. Cornel mentioned that we're in a period of deep, deep polarization. Obviously, that's true. It's in these sorts of periods, the danger periods, 1800, 1860, the 1930s, now, that we should be most vigilant about maintaining the conditions, including the freedoms, necessary for truth-seeking in our institutions of learning and for self-government in our democracy. Now, I promised that that was the final point. I lied, because I want to make one more point, then turn it back over to Cornel. We're tempted to think that a willingness to shut down the other guy, to go to the mat, to destroy the enemy, not just engage him, is a sign of our conviction, of our true conviction, of the depth of our conviction, our belief in justice, our belief in right, our belief in God, our belief in morality. But I think this too is devoutly to be resisted. It's possible for the following two things to exist together. For one to be passionate in one's belief and willing to sacrifice and even die for one's beliefs about justice, about truth, about morality, about God, while at the same time being dispassionate enough to leave room for freedom and for engagement and to be unsettled and to have robust discourse. So I've often said, we human beings, it's part of our nature, tend to wrap our emotions more or less tightly around our convictions. Just the way we are, it's the way we're made. We're not just computers, we're not just pure rationalities. We have emotions, we have feelings, we have passions. And we wrap those feelings, those emotions, those passions around our convictions. That's not even in itself bad. In fact, it's good. If it weren't for the passions and the emotions and the feelings that we attach to our convictions, no one would get anything done. The scholar wouldn't go to work on the scholarly project. The activist for justice wouldn't go to work trying to change the world. The painter, the artist, the musician wouldn't put the work and the effort into creating the music or the painting or the poetry. So we need that emotional oomph to get things done. And yet, if we wrap our emotions too tightly around our convictions, we fall into dogmatism. We refuse to be challenged. We get stuck in our opinions, and we fall so deeply in love with our opinions that that love of opinion eclipses our love of truth. We're not open to challenge. We're not open to change. We're not open to changing our minds. And if we're in a group where everybody tends to think alike, what emerges is a kind of groupthink, a kind of conformity in thinking, which is always toxic to intellectual life, and I think in the end toxic to democracy. Now, Cornel and I are not people who are going to sit here and say, you should dispassionately pursue the truth and never act, because if you act, that will get your juices flowing and your blood heated up, and you'll become a dogmatist. We'd be hypocrites if we said that. We've both been active. We've both been activists. And yet, both of us are very careful to try to avoid falling into that groupthink. When I praised Cornel, praise he richly deserves for being willing to break ranks, criticize people he's not supposed to criticize according to people on his side of the ideological divide. It's because at the same time he's got the dispassion. And I think that's something very much to be emulated. Our choice isn't between passionate pursuit of our goals and pure dispassion. We can have them both. We can be advocates for what we believe in, and at the same time detached enough to allow ourselves to be questioned, to allow ourselves to be free, to remain open to the possibility of changing our minds. End of sermon.
No, indeed, indeed, indeed. I think one of the things also that brings us together is that we both have a profound suspicion of the dominant sensibilities of the neoliberal university. which is to say a conservative brother like Robbie is in some sense in but not fully of the neoliberal university. A radical brother like me, in but not fully of. So the hegemonic frameworks and paradigms to understand the world are for us objects to be Socratized, which is to say to be scrutinized, examined, interrogated in a serious way. And we can do it with a smile and we can do it with civility, but we got our righteous indignation too. Because when you talk about truth tied to the human condition and those persistent realities we've known since the cave, men and women, forms of death, physical, social, psychic, spiritual forms of death, forms of dogma, religious dogma, political dogma, ideological dogma, and domination, structures of domination, be it empire, be it predatory forms of capitalism that subordinate workers, be it vicious forms of white supremacy or male supremacy or deep hatred of Arabs or Muslims or Jews or Palestinians or Tibetans, on and on and on. So the question becomes then, you get these two brothers, vanilla brother, chocolate brother, radical conservative, coming together and saying, here we are situated in an institution that is more and more market-driven, tied to professional attainment. See, Brother Robbie and I have first and foremost a calling before we have a career. We have first and foremost a vocation before we have a profession. And it's always good to reread Max Weber's 2 essays on vocation. Politics is vocation, science is vocation. The difference between what it is to have a vocation tied to invocation, a sense of history, a willingness to be engaged in provocation in the present, as opposed to just on the way to a career. Because careerism is easily a form of intellectual blindness if you don't cast it as an object to be critically reflected upon. And what has happened, I think, and you see this in terms of the request for truth. None of us have possessed truth, capital T. All we're ever going to acquire are small t truths. Now, we're not relativists. The earth is not flat, though it looks that way. You see. But we're contextualists, which is to say we're fallible, which is to say there's forms of intellectual humility. But along with that fallibility and along with that humility is still a certain moral tenacity, a willingness to fight against the grain. Professionalism tends to go hand in hand with protocols of conformity. You can't wait to fit in, especially when it's market driven, because you got a whole lot of goodies there waiting for you. It's hard to give up on those goodies. Especially if you're coming out of a place like Harvard, where, my God, you can really take advantage of those goodies. Can't wait to gain access to that wealth, power, status, and spectacle. You see. Of course, I'm not talking to anybody here, but there's some people at Harvard who are like that. Yeah, there's a slice of folk, a lot of brothers and sisters of all colors here at Harvard who are like that. So what happens, you have to cut against the grain. But cutting against the grain first means intellectually, the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. Whose suffering really counts in the frameworks, in the curriculum? When I arrived at Harvard in the 1970s, it was very much a Eurocentric white affair. Well, white brothers and sisters as human as anybody else. But you had white workers who hardly counted. You had white poor people who hardly counted. The frameworks were preoccupied with the people who mattered. So you got social movements from the outside that said, we're interested in veritas too. And you have to come to terms with the suffering of working people, the suffering of women. And this is not PC chit-chat. This is a serious intellectual project that has everything to do first with what it means to be a decent person, concern about truth, what it means to be tied to the democratic project, in which the demos across the board are to raise their voices, not to be echoes. It's very hard to have a strong critical voice within a market-driven, professionalized space because you get marginalized so quick. You get pushed to the periphery so quick. And you said, oh my God, I want access to the mainstream too. And Robbie and I say, don't be in a hurry to be well-adjusted to injustice and well adapted to forms of indifference. Because for so too often the case, the frameworks in place really don't come to terms with so many folk who supposedly don't count, you see. And I think part of the paradox here is how do we engage in a truthful quest for truth? Because it's easy to talk about quest for truth, but so often those who are involved don't want to be truthful about their quest for truth, in terms of their will to truth. So it's just talking at the surface and not really wanting to barrel in to what's beneath that surface, you see. And so, for example, take certain forms of liberalism and neoliberalism that are in place. And the conservatives have said over and over again, this market-driven atomistic individualism is going to lead toward highly polarized, isolated individuals who lose the capacity to connect with one another, even more and more lose the capacity for intimacy. And the cash nexus becomes the fundamental way in which they relate to each other. That's conservative critiques of market capitalism. Now, as a left-wing brother, I can resonate with elements of that without accepting the conclusions of it, you see. Brother Robbie can read a text by Marx, and Marx would say, you allow your monopolies and oligopolies to take over and allow these workers to have two or three generations of wage stagnation and have a sense of helplessness and impotence and hopelessness. And you don't think that polarization is going to escalate? You don't think grotesque wealth inequality will generate forms of distrust and unbelievable despair tied to increasing poverty and increasing paranoia so that you end up losing your democracy? That's from a certain left-wing Marxist point of view. And I can hear Brother Robbie saying, well, I don't like those socialist conclusions, but there's some insights there. Is that true?
It's true.
Absolutely. We learn from one another. It overlaps. The tension is there. The conflict must be there. And we recognize, well, then, how do we then have a certain kind of honesty and candor and get beyond just wearing the pre-professional mask in order to fit into the dominant ways in the neoliberal university? Well, see, we need to rip that veil off and say, oh, you know, the rest of society is undergoing some deep decay and decline. And it's not just the White House, but we could start there. That's so easy. We don't want to overlook it, but don't want to fetishize it either. It's just one site in the American empire. We talk about drones in the Pentagon. We can talk about workers in an economy that seems to be doing so well statistically, and yet the social misery is still escalating because the wealth inequality is still escalating, beginning with the children. 1 out of 2 of black and brown children live in utter poverty in the richest nation of the history of the world, and we don't have a public discourse about it. Or the planet's about to undergo catastrophe or nuclear catastrophe. We can go on and on and on. How do we open up these dialogues in such a way that it's just not a matter of knowing them in order to be smart, but engaging them in order to live a life of a certain kind of calling and vocation? How do you connect statecraft to soulcraft? The neoliberal statecraft, the neoliberal soulcraft, being the smartest in the room. the most clever in the room in order to move to the top of the profession. And smartness and cleverness, as magnificent as they can be in and of themselves, have very little to do with compassion, wisdom, courage, willingness to take a risk, willingness to pay a cost, a willingness to situate yourself in a tradition that allows you to even be who you are. It allows you to connect with the best of the past in order to try to preserve it and maybe authorize a different future, politically, economically, psychically, spiritually, religiously, and so forth and so on, you see. And so that's one of the wonderful things that we benefit from in wrestling with these various issues from our various points of view. Now, with 6:42, and we want to open it up for you can raise your voices. I come from a tradition that says, lift every voice. We want to hear your voice. Any reflections you have, and please don't hesitate. I see my dear sister, was part of the student committee here. They're
While people are coming to the microphone, let me add an additional point to what Cornel said here. This is especially for undergraduates. I know that the IOP, to its very great credit, includes undergraduates as well as Kennedy School graduate students. I think it's really important before it's too late, because 4 years goes by really quickly if you haven't noticed it already. It's really important to ask yourself the question, what am I doing here? I don't mean just at Harvard. What am I doing with this 4 years that I have to study? Am I training for a career? Well, neither Cornel nor I are going to say it's a bad thing to train for a career. It's a good thing to train for a career. Nor are we going to say that it's a bad thing to aspire to a good paying job. We want you all to have good paying jobs. Cornel, you with me on that, aren't you?
It depends on their choices. Yes. I mean, you might have some people will make vows of poverty. That's wonderful. It's not us, but that's wonderful. We appreciate and respect it. We go right ahead.
And we want you to have the status that, and, you know, there's no need to be anything other than candid with each other here. Coming to Harvard confers great status on you. The Harvard degree is an unbelievable credential, one that in itself gives you a lot of status. And you know, you make your choice about where to go to college in part based on the status of the institution, because the status of the institution confers the status on you. That's not bad. There's nothing wrong with it. The question is, in what perspective do I place those things? High-paying profession, status, prestige, social standing. Where are they on my list of priorities? And where does their place on the list of priorities, how does their place on the list of priorities figure in my decisions about what I will do here, what I will study, who I will study with, what my conversations in the dining halls and in the dorms will be like? My entreaty to you is to place those things, as important as they are, and whatever roles they have had in motivating you to be here, and you probably got some reinforcement from your parents about that stuff because they want you to have a good job and have a good profession and rise in the world, or at least maintain the social status that your family has, that you come from. Despite all that, those things have got to be secondary, because what you have on offer here at Harvard is paideia, deep education that is not just vocational, not simply fitting you out with information and skills that will enable you to have a high status, high paying job. You have the opportunity in these 4 years to explore the deep questions of meaning that will enable you not only to be a lifelong learner, which is very important, but to live the examined life. To live a life truly worthy of a human being as a rational creature, what Aristotle called a rational animal. So when you're prioritizing things and thinking of what should I do, what should I take, remember that you have this opportunity to think about the greatest issues, to read the works, from the ancient ones to the modern ones, from the philosophical works to the sociological works, Cornel mentioned Weber, to the literary works, from all traditions, the great religious teachers and teachings, the great philosophers, the opportunity to read all those to assist you in leading the examined life. to assist you in forming yourself as the kind of person who, when you walk out this door, no matter if you're at Goldman Sachs or in the insurance business or whatever, you're creating a new firm or a hedge fund or whatever you guys go on to, working in government, running an anti-poverty program, whatever it is you're going on to do, you are leading the examined life, the life that's really worthy of what you are. And it is so easy to miss it. And believe me, those 4 years are going to go by really, really quickly. And even for those of you who are graduate students, I know you're being trained in a certain sense professionally here, and there are skills that you need and information that you need. There are also opportunities here for thinking about the great questions in the Kennedy School with great thinkers, reading great works, and don't pass those up either. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Kiana. I'm a first year at the college. My question is, what happens when, in challenging our ideas, some people are given a platform for hate, prejudice, misunderstanding? In the movie Denial, about Holocaust denial, Deborah Lipstadt, or at least the woman who plays her, the character says, not all opinions are equal. So my question is, do we have a responsibility still to let ourselves be challenged by opinions that are, quote, not equal? Opinions such as the Holocaust didn't happen, or that slavery wasn't that bad for African Americans.
Appreciate the question. No, it's true. All opinions are certainly not equal at all. Not at all. But I mean, a Holocaust denier is like someone who claims the earth is flat. They're a liar. And then you can look at the motivations for the lie and so forth and so on. I think workers not exploited, black people's never been enslaved. It's all, well, okay, go on and live in Disneyland and fairy tale land, but you don't deserve to lecture at Harvard. We only have 14 weeks every semester. We have to have some high quality people who come to argue. So that you can have conservative folk who are very sophisticated and very subtle and have arguments to put forward. Holocaust deniers and Milosh and all these other folk running around spreading hate against different women and people of color and precious Mexican brothers and sisters, Muslims and Jews, Palestinians, whoever it is. They don't deserve a platform in a place like Harvard because Harvard only has so much time. And so there's ways in which we must have diversity in dialogue across ideology, across politics, and so forth and so on. But you have to meet a certain kind of standard. You see. It's true in physics departments, it's true in sociology departments, it's true in philosophy departments, you see. So that this notion of using free speech as a way of just providing a platform for hate speech needs to be called into question, not because you're shutting anybody down, because you have a commitment to standards. You have a commitment to standards, you see, in that regard. Now, on the other hand, I myself, and I think Brother Robert agrees, I'm libertarian enough to say I fight for the right of people to be wrong. On street corners. On street corners, you can say almost anything as long as you don't engage in injurious harm. You see, if a Klan's brother, sick, pathological, hates me and my mama, he's still got a right to be wrong. But if he engages in injurious harm, I'm a Christian but not a pacifist. You see what I mean? And if the law doesn't come in, then we got a challenge. You see? So in that sense, we still have to make sure there's public spaces we can enter without humiliation and engage in serious argument. But we have to also make discerning judgments as to what quality is and what low quality is. There's a difference between Edward Said and his critique of what's going on in the Middle East. Towering figure, not always right, but often right? As opposed to somebody just coming off the street, hasn't done a whole lot of homework and want to talk about the Middle East. Or same would be true in front of any other issue in that sense. So that your question is a very important one. And a lot of it has to do with student groups, because a lot of times it's the student groups who are choosing some of these low quality folk to come in and spread this hate. And the students themselves have to take responsibility. You only got 14 weeks in a semester. Why are you bringing this person in? Bring in somebody else who really has some serious argument that might lean in that direction, but at least they have a serious argument.
I completely agree with Cornel that quality is the sort of threshold factor. To teach at Harvard, you should be a high-quality thinker. That doesn't mean you have to be on the left. That doesn't mean you have to be on the right. That doesn't mean you have to be in the center. You might be on the left. You might be on the right. You might be on the center. You might be somewhere else. You might be off that particular spectrum. But you got to be high quality. Same with visiting speakers. If you've invited somebody, please don't disinvite them. If you've made a mistake in your inviting, don't disinvite. but exercise good judgment. Again, whether your student group is on the left or on the right or in the center or something else, if you're the Catholic group, the Jewish group, the Muslim group, make sure that the people you are proposing that other people listen to be excellent thinkers. So that's number one. Number two, Cornel and I said in the statement, Truth-Seeking Democracy and Freedom of Thought and Expression, and we're absolutely prepared to stand by it, that we are prepared to listen to and thoughtfully engage, not just hear, listen and thoughtfully engage anybody on any topic who's willing to do business in the proper currency of intellectual discourse, a currency consisting of evidence, reasons, and arguments. Now, there's a difference between somebody we disagree with, or even somebody who's wrong, but who's doing business with evidence and arguments and reasons, and somebody who's just a demagogue. And there are demagogues across the spectrum, and they're always going to be. And demagogues, as the Federalist Papers note several times, are ultimately the real threat to republics. They're the real threat to what we today call democracies. But still, we can't shut down the demagogue. We have to answer the demagogue. But it's one thing to answer and try to defeat the demagogue in the political sphere, but where you have a person who's not a demagogue, who's doing business as the demagogue doesn't, in the currency of reasons and arguments and evidence, then you should engage. Third point, we mustn't be too quick to dismiss people who disagree with us on the grounds that they must be haters, they must be bigots, they must be malign, they must be stupid, or anything like that. The history of man and women, the history of humanity, the history of intellectual life is littered with orthodoxies that were challenged and ultimately overthrown by people who were regarded as nuts and dangerous and even malignant. Orthodoxies can form around certain sort of opinions that make it nearly impossible to take seriously anybody who challenges that opinion. I don't know if any of you have looked at the history of eugenics. Starting before the Nazis, they didn't invent it. The book that defended the concept of Lebenswertes Leben, a lives unworthy of life, was not written by Nazis. It was written by Democrats, not I mean Democratic Party, small d, Democrats, Weimar figures, Binding and Hoche, a very distinguished medical professor and a lawyer, polite, well-educated people. The Nazis took the idea and ran with it, but there were lots of non-Nazis who were eugenicists. Right over at Harvard Law School, one of the great towering figures in the history of law, big portrait of him up there in the Griswold building. Oliver Wendell Holmes, famous for his eugenics advocacy, famously said in upholding the coercive sterilization of a woman who was supposed to be a, quote, imbecile, unquote, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. But when eugenics was riding high, it was almost impossible for anybody who was sophisticated, learned, progressive, to question the eugenics policy. Who could be against it? Who doesn't want to improve the gene pool? Who doesn't want people to be smarter and stronger and better? There's a wonderful book by my Princeton colleague, Tim Leonard. His real name is Thomas. You can look up the book, Thomas Leonard, on the way in which the progressive movement fell for the eugenics idea hook, line, and sinker. The churches, the mainline churches, the philanthropic institutions, the great foundations, the great corporations, educational institutions. Now, at the time, there would have been people saying to critics of eugenics, these people are nuts, they're religious fanatics, they're crazies. Now, that doesn't mean that anybody who challenges a prevailing orthodoxy is a genius and a hero and a prophet and a seer. But it does mean the lesson in that for us is let's not be too quick to dismiss. And if we're too quick to dismiss, it's probably in part because 1, of the groupthink, and 2, we've wrapped our emotions really tightly around that particular conviction.
I did, brother, up on the...
Yeah, hi, Jay Gleason. Can we really have free, full speech, let alone robust dialogue, in this country anymore after that 2010 Supreme Court decision in Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. Are we really paying enough attention to the way in legal and behind the scenes means that free speech in a formal way is being chipped away at in this country? That decision has very ominous ramifications. Obama probably set back free speech more than any other president in recent history, and that's just one example. But that one needs to be revisited, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it takes a lot of time to unpack your formulation and interpretation, my brother, but certainly it's the case. You never have full-fledged speech at any particular historical moment, let alone in any democracy. It's subject to balance of forces. Who's going to fight to try to expand the space? The space will expand, the space will contract. You know, you got, espionage acts. You've got universities pushing out professors. World War I, Charles Beard, Paul Sweezy here at Harvard. The Marxists pushed out under the Smith Act, so forth and so on. It depends on the quality, courage of the citizens to try to either preserve or expand the space in which free speech, fearless speech can take place. But it goes back and forth, back and forth. And I do think that there's a host of ways in which, as you note, that the courts have made it difficult to expand free speech, made it difficult for certain voices to be heard. You see, corporate voices, big-moneyed voices, wealthy voices, tied to their politicians who they often view as extensions of themselves and so forth, so that the voices of poor people, the voices of poor children, the voices of working people, very difficult to be heard. There's no doubt about that. And you can imagine, as a black person in white supremacist America, I understand very clearly the ways in which free speech can be shut down. W.B. Du Bois, one of the greatest public intellectuals of the modern world, shut down, passport taken, house arrest, Paul Robeson. We can go on and on and on. So there's examples in which there's contraction, expansion. It depends on whether each generation is willing to keep a free and democratic project alive such that we can have a robust space, but it's always precarious. It's always contingent.
There are policies, I think, that need to be examined where courts are not necessarily involved, and then there are cases that I think need to be reconsidered.
As a lawyer, do you agree with that decision?
I'd have to go back and revisit the decision myself to offer an opinion.
It's a really grave decision that I don't think enough people have really recognized or paid full attention to or considered the full weight of the implications for it.
But I think the point we have to keep in mind is free speech has to be defended at every point, and not simply from courts. Absolutely, right? It's policies as well as courts. And there's another important dimension of it. If free speech is going to survive and give us the benefits that when free speech does survive it gives us, then it means that in every generation, people are going to have to rush to the defense of speakers they disagree with. It is not going to work if the conservatives defend the free speech of conservative speakers and progressives defend the free speech of progressive thinkers, but conservatives don't defend progressive free speech and progressives don't defend conservative free speech. There was Mark Lamont Hill. So when Mark Lamont Hill was under threat of being fired, I think he was fired by CNN. Under threat of being fired by Temple University for views he'd expressed on the Middle East. Cornel went to his defense, but entirely independently. Cornel and I didn't talk about this. I went to his defense publicly as well. Now, I doubt that Mark Lamont Hill and I agree on much, but this was a clear violation, or a threatened violation, by an academic institution of freedom of speech. So it was important that there be conservatives defending Mark Lamont Hill in the same way that it's important for progressives to be defending conservative speakers who are threatened to have their speech shut down, whether it's on a college campus or somewhere else. Part of the democratic project that we're trying to uphold here involves defending the principles of the project, including free speech. And everybody's got to do that on a nonpartisan, ideologically fair way basis. Absolutely critical.
Absolutely. We got a question right here.
Yeah,
Oh,
I think
I'm
over
sorry.
here, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
sorry.
we-
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, professors. My name is Nusheen. I'm a pediatrician and a mid-career MPA student here at Kennedy. To piggyback off the first question about hate speech, my question for you is, knowing now that words actually can harm, especially young developing psyches, and let's not kid ourselves, older psyches too, what would you propose to ensure free speech and open dialogue while also protecting some of the most vulnerable in society who have been targeted by rhetoric?
I appreciate that question, because one is that the crucial thing is that we have to have people, especially everyday people, who are fortified against the lies that will be told against them. There's no way a woman can grow up in a vicious patriarchal society and think that there's going to be patriarchal free spaces for her. She's got to be fortified to know these are lies tied often to crimes, local as well as international. So that I think if we try to deal with protecting people who will be the objects of lies, we're never going to get too far. It's a matter of being armed personally, spiritually, morally, to say, in the face of this kind of mendacious bombardment, I can situate it and continue on and flower and flourish to the best of my ability. And that's very important, you see, because if we get in the business of thinking that somehow we'll be able to keep track of the lies, I mean, my God, just keeping track of the lies out of the White House is an encyclopedic activity, let alone from other sources. You see what I mean? So that, but this is what history is. This is what being human is. How fortified will you be in the face of the forms of death, dogma, and domination coming at you? And can you resist and have resilience with the principles that we're talking about? Integrity. It's not a matter of just group affiliation. It's not about women with women, straights with straights, gays with gays, blacks with blacks, browns. No. What kind of integrity and principle are you willing to stand on? And can we fortify our precious folk who are being bombarded all the time? Does that make sense?
Thank you.
No, absolutely.
Let me add to what Cornel said there, that I think it's very important not to depend on the law to do too much. We have to depend for most of the protection that I think you're looking for on civil society, strong institutions of civil society, institutions of religion, family, civic associations, affinity groups. These types of institutions, as Tocqueville pointed out, this is not some new insight of Robert George's. Tocqueville is pointing this out in the 1830s, really, in his own way, and handling it to the extent that we can that way, and not through legal mechanisms, is much safer to liberty, and it's much safer to maintaining Republican government, democracy. The second thing I'd point out, I'd add to what Cornel said, is, the concept of harm is very slippery. We disagree about so many things in this society, and not just the crazies at the extremes. Reasonable people of goodwill disagree about so many things that it includes disagreements about what is harmful, and even disagreements about what constitutes harm. Now, the typical way we try to solve that in some cases is to try to kick the issue over to the scientists. Oh, it's a scientific question. We'll figure out on the basis of science what harm is and what causes harm. Now, you can get somewhere with that sometimes, but this presupposes that all these debates over harm are debates over harm considered as a value-free principle, that our values do not influence or affect our conceptions of harm, or that they should not. But I think that's not actually true to much of reality. Much of reality, and if we're going to get it right for human beings, we can't simply rely on the scientists because they can't tell us. When it comes to the value issues, we've got to get the values right to the extent that we can, frail, fallen creatures that we are, without the assistance of the scientists. Scientism is a real danger. Hayek warned about it all the way back in the 50s. It's now become almost a truism to warn about it. So I'm probably preaching to the choir about this. But as powerful and good as science is, when we try to rely on it to do the work that only ethics can do, that only values can do, we're going to be dooming ourselves to disappointment.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Let's go right ahead.
My name's Gabby. I'm a sophomore at the college. You guys have mentioned labor a few times tonight. And concerning this theory of rationalization, as society becomes more and more rational and more disenchanted, there seems to come with it a sense of almost defeat, and that because we can never reach an objective truth, that it might be fruitless to even try. So what would you say to people who are unwilling to engage in tough dialogue because they might see it as there's not really an end to those means?
Yeah, I appreciate that
Powerful
question too, definitely. And anytime we invoke the great Max Weber, rationalization, bureaucratization, professionalization, it goes hand in hand with Marx's talk about commodification, market-driven. It goes hand in hand with Zimmel talks about objectification, where you objectify each other and make it difficult to be in contact with the humanity of other people by reducing them to objects. So all of these are happening simultaneously. There's no such thing as modern bureaucratization and rationalization without capitalist modes of commodification, without human modes of objectification, and what kinds of countervailing forces can be in place. You're right, Weber says we end up in an iron cage. And that's a very powerful formulation. I resonate with some of that. He's got a downside that we all have to come to terms with. That's why we read our Kafkas and our Chekhovs and Toni Morrisons and others, to come to terms with that downside. But we still can fight. We still can think. We still can love. We still can laugh. We still can bond. We still can organize and mobilize and so forth. And that is really the key more than anything else. What are the conditions under which we can sustain our ability to be resilient and even resist? And that's very important. Weber understood that too. No matter how bad and grim it looks, somehow we're the kind of primates with language that allows us still to think, to love, to fight, to organize, to sacrifice, with no guarantee of winning. Weber didn't see any ultimate triumph. You read a lot of Dostoevsky, as you know. He didn't see a lot of ultimate triumph. But he was concerned about whether people would have what it takes to take up the burden of freedom and not just defer to authority, be uncritical, and kowtow to dogma and orthodoxy and so forth. And he did not do that in his own life. Marx didn't. Toni Morrison doesn't, and a host of others. Now, as a sophomore, you're in that stage where this intellectual excitement is setting in with all of these different theorists and so on. And yet you also bring something to it, your own past, your own family, your own traditions, and so forth and so on. And in the end, it's going to be where you come down, your voice, your perspective, your witness, your stamp that you leave before the worms get you or me or anybody else in terms of our death.
I think it's a wonderful question. Just a couple of thoughts about it. One, I think it's very important that we not infer from the fact that disenchantment seems to be spreading in our culture, or the elite sectors of our culture, or the intellectual sectors of our culture, not infer that that means the world is becoming a disenchanted place. There are some places in which the world is becoming more enchanted. There's some places where the world is becoming more religious, more open to spiritual realities and to the spiritual quest. And even in our own society, there have been cycles, there have been revivals, there's been up and down. And even among the disenchanted, one finds a certain sort of enchantment. Even among the disenchantment, people proclaim themselves to be great advocates and partisans and defenders of human rights. Now there's an enchanted concept. You can't touch them, you can't taste them, you can't feel them. They're not like tables, but we believe in them. If they're not material realities, what kind of realities are they? We try to avoid the word spiritual, but we need something to account for the belief, even of the so-called disenchanted, in such realities. And so you find even people who identify themselves as disenchanted talking about their own quasi or pseudo religions. Ronald Dworkin, toward the end of his life, the great legal philosopher, writing his essay on Religion Without God. Mill did the same thing. Dewey did the same thing in A Democratic Faith. Tony Kronman of the Yale Law School, his book with the provocative title Reflections of a Modern Pagan, or something like that. A critic of that view, but one who I think understands the sort of enchantment of the disenchanted very well, is Stephen Smith, who has a new book out, is professor of law and a philosopher at University of San Diego. His new book out called Pagans and Christians in the Public Square. And it's about the relationship of some modern ideas with ancient Roman and Greek and other forms of paganism. So that's the first point. The second one is our skepticism, which in itself is a good thing. It's what causes us to question ourselves and unsettle each other and form institutions like universities where we should be unsettling each other and unsettling ourselves. That skepticism, which is a good thing, is not itself immune from skeptical scrutiny. Otherwise, it becomes a dogma. Disenchantment becomes a dogma. There's nothing less rational than presupposing the truth of skepticism about religion or morality or anything else. If the skeptical attitude, what I would prefer to call the Socratic attitude, the questioning attitude, the interrogative position, if that's the correct one, which I believe it is, then skepticism itself, of course, has to be subjected to that kind of scrutiny. I wonder to what extent the real challenge for us is not from scientific materialism, which is, we're often told, is what's at the root of our disenchantment, but rather from something that is more familiar to readers of Nietzsche, something like the will to power, the idea, and here I'm not invoking Nietzsche. Nietzsche's own view is more complicated than this, but the view that at the end of the day, all we have are our feelings, and we go with them and we act on them, and they're just not subject to rational scrutiny of any type. If you have yours and I have mine and they're in conflict, then all we have is a struggle for power. I've got to destroy you or you've got to destroy me. We can have no dialogue. That, I think, is the arrow pointed at the heart of everything Cornel and I have been advocating, everything that we stand for. The idea that at the end of the day, conversation is of no use because reason cannot tell you anything other than how to get what you already want, where your wants or goals, whether they're political or otherwise, are determined not by any kind of intellectual activity, but rather just by feelings and emotions. Once we've gotten that, then we divide into tribes and it's war. I see where...
But we got our
one more.
But the student leader, Keziah, where?
Kessia.
Kessia, yeah. Is it all right for us to go a little bit longer?
Let's take another question.
Just one, okay. Just one, because we can go 2 or 3 if you like now. But all right, no, I just want to get permission. From the leaders here. All right, go right ahead.
My name is Hamza. I'm a student in the Divinity School.
Speak right into that microphone. We can hear your voice, my brother.
Yeah, is this working? Yeah, this is working.
There you go.
So I'm a student in the Divinity School, and Dr. George, you've been really critical of Islamophobia in the conservative movement.
Of what?
You've been really critical of Islamophobia in the conservative movement. And
Islamophobia.
You have a really good relationship with Hamza Yusuf that's very heartening to see.
Oh, well,
You've
my dear
spoken
friend.
of how a lot of socially conservative Muslims will turn to the progressive movement because they feel alienated by the right wing. But I think another reason for that is American Muslims are very critical of American militarism for obvious reasons. So I wonder if in your formulation of Christian conservatism, there's room, or if you are critical of American militarism, are you critical of the occupation of Palestine, the American-funded Saudi bombing of Yemen, American drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, which, Christianity is not too big on killing innocent civilians, so I wonder if you would be critical of that. And then Dr. West, my question for you is that Bernie Sanders announced that he's running for president this morning. Will you be endorsing him again, and will you be going hard on the campaign trail for him again?
Appreciate. You want to go first, my
Do
brother?
you want me to give you a couple of minutes to formulate decide what you're going
Yeah,
to do?
that's right. I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray on that second question. I'm going to pray on that one.
I don't like. I'm not like Cornel in speaking of American empire, and I don't speak of American militarism. I realize that is your view, and that's Cornel's view. It's not my view. I do think that we should proceed on this on a retail rather than a wholesale basis. Is this use of military power, projection of military power, legitimate or not? Is it badly motivated or is it well motivated? If it's well motivated, is it nevertheless a mistake? Is it going to do more harm than good? Is it going to fail or is it not? Now, where I have been critical, out in front, I think even before the progressives came on board, was the use of drones in ways that create collateral damage, so-called collateral damage, killing lots of innocent people to protect a small number of people who would otherwise, of course, be at risk and vulnerable if you did not use the drone strategy. The drone strategy started with President Bush, and then it was expanded very significantly by President Obama, and Cornel West was right in the forefront of criticizing President Obama for that expansion. So I have a strict view of just war. Like Cornel, I'm not a pacifist. I don't go that far. But I think that the principles of just war, both justice with respect to when and whether to go to war, and the conduct of the war, and especially the principle of non-combatant immunity, those are absolutely crucial. And too often in our own history, and I've been critical of this, much too often in our own history, we have disrespected those just war principles. So in those cases, yes, absolutely. Now, by the way, that includes the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Absolutely.
Right. So in those cases, although I think World War II was a justified war, the war against fascism, the war against Nazism, I don't think the way we ended the war in Japan was morally legitimate. So I think you have to go on an individual retail basis rather than wholesale. I generally don't sign up for wholesale projects because I think things are complicated. And everybody, that's one quick way to fall into tribalism, is go on the wholesale project. Our group is against this and this and this and this and this. The other group is for this, 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 and this and this. I want to know about the this and the particular this and the particular that.
But I think most importantly, on the moral and spiritual front, that Brother Robbie and I agree that a precious baby in Japan, in Ethiopia, in Massachusetts, in Tel Aviv, Gaza, in Guatemala, Mexico, they all have exactly the same value.
That's right.
Which means the lens through which you view the world, this is where Martin Luther King becomes important in terms of militarism. The lens through which you view the world is one in which you cannot view it solely through the strategic and tactical calculations of the deployment of power. This is not the triumph of Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. This has to do with integrity, moral, spiritual integrity. So if we have an analysis, let's say, in which there's an invasion and occupation of a country, and 500,000 of those precious folk are killed and never even mentioned in the U.S. press, you know you've got very, very deep indifference and callousness to those precious lives. And that needs to be pointed out. And this is not just in relation to drones, but it's in relation to a number of different U.S. invasions and occupations that we hardly say a word about. It could be the Philippines. Those Filipinos have exactly the same folk value as black babies in Roxbury. You see what I mean? So that needs to be pressed over and over again as human beings and as Christians and as Democrats in that regard. Now, one of the reasons why I do like to spend time around my dear brother Bernie Sanders is that he comes out of a tradition as a secular Jewish brother from Brooklyn that's linked to the great legacy of Jerusalem that says, to be human is to spread hesed, steadfast love and loving kindness to the widow, the orphan, the fatherless, the motherless, the oppressed, the subjugated. So when he looks at America, he doesn't look at America through the stock market. He looks at America through the lens of how working people are doing. That's why the critique of Wall Street is relentless. I like that about Bernie. I like that about Bernie because he's honest about uplifting the very folk who usually are forgotten. Now, some other people talk about that, but not really follow through. Now, I have critiques of Bernie. You know, Bernie's a human being, too. And so he doesn't talk enough about empire for me. But I mean, you know, anybody talk about empire in my way would probably get about 16 votes. or get shot the first day they announce, you know what I mean?
Not for that.
But at least Bernie is moving in that direction based on the moral and spiritual front, and he is a secular brother. So it's not as if, you know, we religious folk have ever had a monopoly on goodness. No, we got gangsters and thugs shot through my own Christian tradition against Muslims and Jews and black people and women and gays and lesbians and so forth, you see. But at the same time, we've also had some prophetic ones. And so, yes, it's true, I talked with Brother Bernie about a week ago, and so it was on his mind. But the problem is we've got such a truncated group of neoliberals and centrists and quasi-progressives. They want to all act like they progressive now. Of course, 4 years ago, they were saying, if Bernie was saying that, he was far left. And Bernie is not far left. Bernie is
far left to me.
Yeah, far left. That's true. That's true about this brother Ralph. But no, I've got some comrades who make Bernie look like a Boy Scout centrist.
Oh, boy.
Oh, yes, I do. I'm serious revolutionaries. I'm a revolutionary Christian, so I've got some I resonate with some of what they're talking about. You see what I mean? But my point is this, that we have to deal with a truncated electoral political system. And we need to say that at Kennedy School. Because the Kennedy School can get so excited about all these politicians coming through. Oh, my God, they're here. We get a chance to dialogue. We can hear what they have to say, and we need to listen closely to what they have to say. And it's good they are here, but what is the framework? Are they talking about 56 cents for every dollar that goes to the military-industrial complex? What kind of interrogation is taking place there? Are they talking anything about the drone strikes? Are they talking about the 4,800 military units and 587 military units around the world and 128 special operations of the United States in different countries? Are they willing to tell those kind of truths? Or at least raise the issue, you see? And Kennedy School has students that say, we're glad you politicians are here, but you're here to be Socratized. This is not no propaganda site. You're here for conversation, dialogue, critical. Is that right, Brother Dean? Yes. Absolutely. Is that right, Brother Director? Because I tell you, I was a fellow at the Institute of Politics in 1970. And we had some serious Socratic energy going on in the Institute of Politics. Frank Fidel, those are the old days. Oh, yes, indeed, indeed. I wrote a thesis with the IOP. At 18 years old, and it was a serious critique of my own hometown of Sacramento, California, the political machine and the way in which these black politicians were coming in and acting like they somehow going to be the next liberators of black folk, like they Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. I said, wait a minute, you little middle-class politicians. Don't be posing and posturing like somehow you leading a social movement. You got to adjust yourself in the structural constraints of that political system like anybody else. You just want to act like somehow you got some Nat Turner in you. And that's fine, because everybody got their lane. Politicians can't speak the way I speak. That's good. Somebody got to speak the way I speak. It's a different lane, it's a different kind of calling, but you keep them accountable, answerable, responsible. That's what we were about in IOP in the 1970s. So it is at the best of IOP and the best of the Kennedy School, but you all got some challenges ahead. Deep challenges ahead. My dear brother, colleague Muhammad, who I love so deeply, and salute that brother all the time. I'm so glad he's here to try to create that kind of space. Gons has been here to create that kind of space. You've had some voices, but you got to make sure that dialogue remains intense. That's why we're here. And student leader, should we bring it to a close now? All right, thank you so very much.